All right, my subject for today is St. Thomas Aquinas, possibly the greatest Christian philosopher there ever was, and also one of the people who helped make the Reformation necessary. So it's a little odd to be talking about St. Thomas Aquinas in a Presbyterian church. I'll tell you a little about how I came to be doing this and what my background is. My name is Michael Covington, and this is part of our series on 12 Christians everyone should know. And first of all, who was St. Thomas Aquinas? Well, he lived in the Middle Ages, in the 1200s. He brought Greek philosophy to Christendom. That's his big accomplishment. He made ancient Greek philosophy accessible to Christians. I'm going to give you an example of one of his philosophical analyses, how he tackles the question, is God bound by logic? I'm going to talk about his influence on the Catholic Church, which was enormous. I'm going to briefly mention a Protestant theologian who follows in Aquinas' footsteps, Norman Geisler, and he also composed songs, and you're going to hear one of them. See a couple of them and hear one of them actually audibly. How do I come into this? It's a little odd for a Protestant in a Protestant church to be giving a talk about this great hero of the Roman Catholic Church. Just to clear things up, because there was once a misunderstanding, I am not and have never been Catholic. I went to a Catholic school in 7th and 8th grades. That triggered in me a deep respect for the Catholic Church, a clear understanding of the points of doctrine on which I think they are mistaken, and an abiding interest in church history and in relations between different branches of Christendom. Now, in graduate school, studying linguistics, I did a dissertation on a group of medieval philosophers who came slightly after Aquinas and who analyzed how language carries meaning. This was one of the mysteries in the history of logic and linguistics at the time. What did these medieval people know? We know that they were good at logic. I read their works in Latin, which included traveling to Europe and reading actual handwritten parchment manuscripts, one of which was full of doodles that had hands pointing at things. And it turned out those doodles had been put there by Roger Bacon, definitely a big name. And his book was in my hands. I felt like I was in the presence of something really important. Now, the interesting thing about my dissertation is it more or less put an end to that area of research because people wanted to know what these medieval grammarians knew, and I dug it out and presented it, and okay, problem solved. It more or less ended that as a research specialty, and I immediately went into computational linguistics. Those of you who have had Latin in high school or college, I'm using Church Latin pronunciation this morning, similar to Italian, like the late Middle Ages in Southern Europe, not like what the Romans used and you heard in high school. Okay, with these preliminaries out of the way, who was Thomas Aquinas? Perhaps the single greatest philosopher that Christendom has produced. He is often considered the official philosopher of the Catholic Church. He was born around 1225 in Aquino, Italy. Now, this name is common in Spanish and is pronounced Aquino there, but in Italy, the place is Aquino. It's south of Rome. He was born into a wealthy, noble family, died in 1274, and was declared a saint in 1323. Too late to also be a saint for the Eastern Orthodox, who had split in 1054. He was well educated from elementary school on. As you imagine, that was uncommon in the Middle Ages, but there were beginning to be places that had good education if you were rich enough for it. In particular, the Abbey of Monte Cassino, which Aquinas' family was connected with, offered very good schooling at all levels by the standards of the time. Thomas always planned on a clerical career. That's what his family planned for him. But he did one very rebellious thing. Instead of joining the Benedictine order, which his family had good connections with, he went and joined the Dominicans. What a rebellious thing for a teenager to do, right? He got flack for that for the rest of his life, but it was absolutely the right thing to do. The Dominicans were academic educators and theologians and were exactly where he belonged. Thomas is his given name. He had no family name. No last names in those days. He had no family name. He probably called himself Thomas of Aquino. Aquinas, or Aquinas, means from Aquino. And that's what I'm going to call him because there are so many other Thomases in church history. But he called himself Thomas, and there are people who are sticklers for still calling him that. His philosophical system is called Thomism, the system of Thomas. Of this Thomas, as distinct from various others. There are two really big things to know about what St. Thomas Aquinas contributed to Christian philosophy. Number one, he showed that Christians could use the ancient Greek philosophy and science of the non-Christian philosopher Aristotle. That's what Aquinas did, brought Aristotle to Christendom. And the other big thing to know is that Aquinas built a philosophical system based on common sense, based on classifying ideas, rather than trying to find things to reject. So it happens to be also a good system for analyzing other systems. Now, what do I mean by this second point, a philosophical system based on common sense? Well, there are two ways to be a philosopher. One way, which is the predominant way in all modern philosophy, if you've ever had a philosophy course, you found plenty of this. The modern way is to accept only the ideas that you are sure are right. The other way is to try to classify all possible ideas, and then you'll decide which are the good ones, the true ones, the correct ones, versus the mistakes. Aquinas did the second. This is a breath of fresh air to people brought up on modern philosophy. So suppose you are not like Aquinas. Suppose you are anywhere from William of Ockham, a century after Aquinas, all the way to modern British philosophy. You would follow the principle that entities are not to be multiplied beyond necessity. In other words, don't believe in more things than you have to. And this forces your philosophical system to leave out a lot of things that you are sure are true and important, but you haven't adequately analyzed. For example, if you claim to have a modern scientific worldview, you don't have much to say about love or beauty. Philosophically, those are things that are just not within the purview of your scientific worldview, even though as a human being you believe they're important. If you work like Aquinas and like Aristotle, your tactic is to classify all possible ideas and then evaluate them. Aristotle's grand plan was classification. He wanted to amass and organize all the knowledge available in late classical Greece. Well, Aquinas wanted to continue that. This kind of approach gives you an excellent starting point to compare rival theories because you've already thought of them. As you're going along classifying, well, a person could think this, a person could think that. I wonder how we'll find out which one is right. You get to keep all your common sense. It has been said that Thomism is the only philosophical system that lets you keep everything you already know and hold dear without having to discard things that you can't fit into your analysis. Instead of saying there's no scientific account of beauty and art, you say, well, here are some things we know about beauty and art. We'll figure out later how it connects to everything else. The drawbacks of Thomism are you end up with a complicated system. There is a lot to learn. And you may well end up keeping clever mistakes when you should be throwing them out. That is, keeping the bathwater along with the baby, keeping too much bathwater, so to speak. Now, to tell you about Aquinas, I have to tell you about Aristotle, whose heyday was around 350 BC, pupil of Plato. This is slightly after what is called the classical period in Greece. He's late classical. He's actually, if you read Greek, he's speaking an early version of Koine Greek, in which some of the words are spelled differently than in classical Greek, but only slightly. Aristotle's goal was to classify all existing knowledge and write a book on every subject he could think of, everything from rhetoric to meteorology. 2 books on scientific method called Prior and Posterior Analytics, that is Analytics Volume 1 and Volume 2, have been especially important. Now, after the fall of Rome, Greek philosophy became unavailable to Western Europe until, in the Middle Ages, Islamic philosophers who had gotten hold of Greek manuscripts and learned Greek and studied Aristotle, then transmitted the works of Aristotle into Europe. So one really rebellious thing Aquinas did was have dialogue with Muslims. Strange thing for a Christian monk to do, but he got lots of information. He wasn't the only one who had the works of Aristotle. They were coming in and becoming widely known and studied by everybody in the early medieval universities. But Aristotle was relatively new on the scene then, from a Western European perspective, and what to think of him was a big question in the Middle Ages. Perhaps the big question driving medieval European philosophy is, what do we do with Aristotle? What do we do with this non-Christian who seems to know so many good, important things? Aquinas' big question then is, can Christians use science and philosophy from this non-Christian source, or should we just stick with our Bibles? Well, his answer is yes, you can use philosophy and science from a non-Christian source, because a lot of it does not directly involve revealed doctrine. It's knowledge that God has made available to all people through their natural senses and intellect. General revelation, as we call it, as opposed to special revelation. So here's Aristotle in brief. His goal was to classify all kinds of knowledge. He was not oriented toward new discovery. Now, that tended to slow down science in the Middle Ages because they didn't realize that Aristotle was just preparing for discovery. Aristotle wasn't against discovery, he was just doing something else. They tended to think he was too authoritative, and the development of science was slowed down, not by Aristotle, but by people clinging too tightly to Aristotle. Some important concepts from Aristotle are matter and form. That is, a statue can be made of marble and can be in the form of the face of Julius Caesar. Matter and form is a really useful distinction. Actual versus potential, whenever we use those 2 words today, we are speaking Aristotelian. Finite and infinite, a number of others. One that was especially important for Aquinas is essence or substance versus accidental properties. That is, what something is versus what its attributes are. Aristotle did not worship a god, but seemed to be open to some kind of deity, apparently only one deity. He did not seem to be into the worship of Zeus and all those other characters. And the same is true of Plato. Aquinas, using Aristotle's tools of thought, developed a system called realism, and the idea behind realism is the basis of science is not just that there are a lot of things in the world, but also that there is a correct way to classify them. That when you ask whether a mushroom is a plant, for instance, you are asking a scientifically meaningful question. You are not just asking how do humans like to classify mushrooms, but rather there is a difference between animals and plants, and biologists now tell us a couple more as well, that is real and part of the structure of the world around us. Generally, there is a right way to analyze and classify things. If you don't believe that, you don't have science, because that's what science looks for. Now, one idea that Aquinas took in from Aristotle and made much of is that the relation between body and soul is matter and form, like hardware and software. Think about it, hardware and software are matter and form as well. The body and soul of a human being are substance and matter and form, and that means the soul is not a ghost that flies around with or without a body and inhabits your body while you're alive. It is, this would imply, and he never totally worked this out, but it implies that when we go to heaven, even before the final resurrection, our souls are embodied in something that is not physical matter, something temporary. They leave our human bodies and exist in some other way. They are not ghosts capable of existing without any form of embodiment, any more than software can run without a computer. I wish Aquinas had had computers. He would have loved them. I think of him as the patron saint of geeks and nerds. He really was the same kind of person as the people today who delve deeply into computers. Now, I'm going to give you an example of Aquinas' approach to an important philosophical question. Is God bound by logic? Can God do things that are illogical? Well, in 1277, which was a little bit after Aquinas, Archbishop Stephen Tampier of Paris, in his famous condemnation of errors, not all of which were errors, said, no, nothing can limit the omnipotence of God. Logic does not limit the omnipotence of God. If you ask the typical churchgoer today this same question, you're likely to get that answer. I've asked people what they think. Does logic limit God? Well, what do you mean by limit would be part of my response, but let's see how Aquinas did it. Is God bound by logic? First thing Aquinas wants to know is what that means, because I can't answer a question if you don't tell me what you mean by it. The Bible says God can do all things, but Aquinas concludes that meaningless combinations of words are not things God either can or cannot do. They are just meaningless combinations of words. So when you talk about, for instance, making a round square, you don't have anything clearly in mind when you say round square. I mean, something that's round and also a square simultaneously and in the same sense. You can't envision any such thing. You've put two words together that don't add up to anything. And those words don't describe something God can or cannot do, any more than totally meaningless words would. So he was one of the first people on the stage of history to understand this. So when we say that God can't do something contradictory, we're not saying God is limited. We are saying that our language allows us to put words together in a way that sometimes doesn't describe anything. And when we do that, we're not naming something God can't do. We're just putting words together that are contradictory. He was one of the first people on the stage of history to understand logic and language well enough to be able to explain that point. And I think he's absolutely right, by the way. Now, what are the main works of Aquinas? There are two really big ones. The Summa Theologica, or Summa Theologiae, the summary of theology, which is full coverage of Catholic theology. It's long. There is a one-volume edition. I saw it. It's in small print and is about so big and so thick. It's normally printed in something like 6 or 8 volumes, I think. Think of how enormous it must have been in handwritten manuscripts on parchment that only get about 200 pages into a book this thick. And his other major work, the Summa Contra Gentiles, the summary against the Gentiles or against the non-Christians, is about how to evangelize non-Christians, especially Muslims. It's not a book for them to read. It's a book for Christians to read, to learn how other people think and how you might present divine revelation to people who have not understood it or not had it before. Each summa was in question and answer format, which is the normal way of presenting subjects in the Middle Ages. You would have a question, you would have arguments in favor of wrong answers, you would have the correct answer, and then refutation of the arguments in favor of wrong answers. That means that the Summa Theologica contains, among other things, hundreds and hundreds of Bible verses amusingly taken out of context as examples of arguments for wrong answers. And that could be useful. If you want to see how somebody took a verse strangely and then Aquinas answered it, there are indexes of such things. The key idea, and this was the great strength of medieval education, is you don't get to conclude anything unless you can rebut or refute the arguments that are against it. It's not enough to have an opinion. You have to know the best that can be said for the other side, and you have to have an adequate response. In fact, thinking up arguments for the wrong side, thinking up wrong answers and arguments for them, was a major student exercise in the Middle Ages. It's a good thing to practice doing. A lot of people are afraid to even consider a false proposition because they think, oh no, I'll get mixed up, I'll end up believing the wrong thing. No, strengthen your mind a little bit. I mean, that's like not being able to do one push-up if you're afraid at that point. But strengthen your mind just a little. Now, there is an Aquinas quote that I want engraved on my tombstone. Those of you who are still around in the late 22nd century when my time comes, or earlier, remember this. I have this written down for my family to know about. What I want my tombstone to say is veritati non contrariatur veritas. Truth does not conflict with truth. The full sentence from the Summa Contra Gentiles is quod veritati fidei Christianae non contrariatur veritas rationis, that is, that the truth of reason is not contrary, is not opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. That's what I've wrapped my whole intellectual life around all these years. Aquinas has been very influential ever since his own time, although a rival school of thought called nominalism arose about 100 years later and advocated a more lean and clean approach to philosophy, and that's where we get William of Ockham, among others. And I would say philosophy today is more nominalist than realist, although science is more realist than nominalist. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII, recall the current Leo is the 14th, so this is the previous Leo, in 1879, directed that Aquinas' philosophy be widely taught in the Catholic Church and used basically as their official philosophy. Ever since, there's been an awful lot of Thomism. Every Catholic priest you ever meet is schooled in Thomism. Thomism has the big advantage that it's good at describing and comparing other systems of philosophy. It's bigger, it can describe the other things. And so it comes in very handy for analyzing theories, including much newer ones. Now, Aquinas' influence on the Catholic Church, he gave them the way to articulate one of their most controversial doctrines. Already in his own time, Aquinas was able to use Aristotle's concept of substance and attributes to articulate the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation says that in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, the consecrated bread and wine become not just represent the body and blood of Christ, but without any change in their physical properties. Does that even make sense? A lot of Protestants would say it does not, that you've created a particularly confusing situation here, but How can the bread and wine change into the body and blood of Christ without any change in their physical properties? Is it logical to even say that, or is it like talking about round squares? Are we putting words together in a way that does not add up to mean anything? Well, Aristotle and Aquinas to the rescue. The essence of something is distinct from its properties, its attributes, its accidental properties as they're called, just as I would remain who I am even if I suddenly turned green. I don't know if we have a video special effects department that can do that. Probably not. The video audience will not get to see me turn green. Neither will you. But the idea of transubstantiation is the essence of the bread and wine changes while all the properties remain the same. If you analyzed it chemically, it's still bread and wine. Now, this is the opposite of what we see in the natural world. In the natural world, we see a lot of things with their essence staying the same and their properties or attributes changing, right? We see that all the time. You can see it as I have grayer hair this week than last. But Aquinas says with transubstantiation we have the other way around, that the essence changes while the properties, the accidental properties, remain the same. Well, at least he has a way to describe it. He can say precisely what this doctrine is. Transubstantiation was already around in his time as a widely held but poorly understood belief, and Aquinas' framework helped it gain footing and be taught as authoritative doctrine. Protestants do not accept it, neither do Eastern Orthodox Christians who split with the Catholics in 1054 AD. We would say, I think, that Jesus is spiritually present in the act of worship, maybe even linked in some way spiritually to the bread and wine, but there's not a change of essence or anything like that. The bread is still bread. Gluten-free at our church, in fact. Well, I don't mean to poke fun. It's something about which people are very reverent, but I do want to point out a doctrinal difference there. With his systematization of Catholic doctrine, Aquinas also articulated a list of 7 sacraments, not just 2. Up until him, it had been sort of a toss-up whether you have 2 principal sacraments and 5 minor ones, or 7 on the same level, or just 2 and the other 5 are not quite the same kind of thing. He articulated the concept of purgatory, a temporary state that you go to before going to heaven in order to finish expiating your sins. I think we Protestants normally believe that if Jesus can forgive your sins, he can do everything necessary, and you don't have any more work ahead of you before entering into the fellowship of the Lord. And he articulated the notion of indulgences, which is a complicated matter and helped to provoke the Reformation. These were not new ideas of his, but he gave them a clearer expression than they had before and helped them gain acceptance. Catholic doctrine became more Catholic, and Aquinas arguably helped make the Reformation necessary. So we can't take everything that he says, but we can learn a lot from him. And I want to briefly point to a Protestant theologian, Norman Geisler, who was pretty close to being a Thomist and a very good Christian apologist and systematic theologian. His book, Unshakable Foundations, is one of his many works. And I want to show you from that book his treatment of the abortion controversy, not for its content, but for its style. Question is, what about abortion? Here are arguments in favor of abortion. He then delivers the crushing blow. All of these arguments assume that a fetus does not have the right to life that a human being does. If you discard that false assumption, then you refute them all. So this is Aquinas' style. Arguments for the other side, followed by refutation. I think it's a good way to handle difficult questions. Now, the last thing Aquinas was noted for was composing hymns, some of which are still sung. One of them that you hear at Christmas at least if you listen to a lot of records, as I do, is Panis Angelicus. How many of you have heard Panis Angelicus? Am I the only one? Okay, you're good Protestants. You've not heard Panis Angelicus. It's basically a hymn about transubstantiation. Another one that you have heard, almost certainly, if you have ever heard a Gregorian chant, you have heard this one, Pange lingua gloriosi, sing my tongue of the glorious mystery. And one verse of it, tantum ergo sacramentum, so great a sacrament, is often sung separately. By the way, Pange lingua gloriosi is not only the most widely sung Gregorian chant that I can find. Here's a bit of pop music trivia. Do any of you, I'll tell you the connection in a moment. I think most of us were around in 1974 when there was a Spanish song that made the hits in America called Eres Tú. Does anybody remember that? No, I'm not going to sing it on video. Well, anyway, it was by a Spanish group that also made the charts in Spain with a pop setting of Pange lingua gloriosi. I don't have that here to play for you, don't have either of them, but it's that big a piece of world music that it just keeps being appreciated by different people in different places. Both of those, as I just said, are about the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Panis Angelicus is basically about transubstantiation. Pange lingua gloriosi is wider ranging and is the one I am going to introduce you to. It's also about the Lord's Supper, but it is not all about transubstantiation. Pange lingua gloriosi is one of my favorite hymns, except that I cannot sincerely sing the part that asserts transubstantiation. Fortunately, I can leave out one verse, and fortunately, most people leave out some of the verses because there are quite a few of them. I'm going to show you two verses that are often sung, and you will get to hear part of one of them. The beginning of it, Pange lingua gloriosi corporis mysterium sanguinisque preciosi, quem in mundi pretium fructus ventris generosi rexi furit gentium. Sing my tongue the mystery of the glorious body and the precious blood, which the King of Nations, the fruit of a generous or maybe noble womb, that is Jesus born of Mary, poured out to redeem the world. He poured out his blood as the price of the world, as it says in the Latin there. And the other verse you hear often, tantum ergo sacramentum veneremur cernui, such a great sacrament we honor, bowing down, and let the ancient example give way to the new ceremony. Let faith lend supplementum, whatever fills in, whatever is needed to fill in what our senses lack. Okay? And this is something we can sing without believing in transubstantiation, because we can certainly honor the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and all that it stands for. Now, we can actually hear this. By the way, with a slightly north of the Alps Latin pronunciation, this is apparently a choir in Poland, but here they go. This is what worship sounded like in the Middle Ages. Imagine yourself in a great cathedral. There, that is what it would have been like to worship with St. Thomas Aquinas in his own time and environment. What I'd like to do now is close us in prayer using a prayer composed by St. Thomas Aquinas. He had many prayers that were basically about studying and learning, and this is one of them. Grant me grace, O merciful God, to desire ardently all that is pleasing to Thee, to examine it prudently, to acknowledge it truthfully, and to accomplish it perfectly, for the praise and glory of Thy name. Amen. Well, thank you for coming.